Curiosity was the first thing the snow taught me that winter, the way it covered tracks yet invited questions, the way silence itself seemed to ask who we really were when no one was looking. I remember how the town leaned toward rumors the way frost leans toward glass, eager to cling, eager to blur what lay beneath. It was in that season that Elias Crow stood at the edge of our lives, and none of us truly saw him. Elias was 34 then, though the mountains had aged him beyond numbers. He was called a mountain man, spoken with a half-smile and a half-warning, as if strength itself were something to fear. He owned land, traps, cattle wintered high where others could not keep them alive, yet he walked into town alone, heavy boots slow against the boardwalk, eyes lowered not in shame but in habit. People said he was dangerous because he spoke little, because he did not explain himself, because his shoulders carried the kind of power that made smaller men uneasy. Wealth clung to him like another rumor, one more reason to keep distance, one more excuse to believe he was hard. What no one said aloud was that Elias had been alone for a long time. Loneliness leaves marks subtler than scars, but just as deep. He never lingered in town, never sat near the stove where men told stories that grew kinder with each telling. He bought what he needed, nodded once, and returned to the white quiet of the mountains, as if the cold were more forgiving than people. If he noticed the way mothers pulled daughters closer when he passed, he gave no sign. Silence had become his safest shelter. That same winter brought Clara Whitlow to us, carried in by a train that shrieked like it regretted stopping. She was 25, though her eyes held the careful watchfulness of someone older. Snow clung to the hem of her dress, thin and worn, and to her lashes when she looked up at the town as if hoping it might look back kindly. It did not. She had no family waiting, no man stepping forward with a smile practiced for such moments. She stood alone on the platform, hands folded tight, as if holding herself together were a skill she had learned through long necessity. Clara's story arrived before she did, whispered through the post office and the general store. A woman left behind. A woman with no prospects. A woman who would be trouble simply by needing warmth and food. Mrs. Hawthorne shook her head with performative sympathy, saying it was a shame, though her eyes measured Clara like a ledger. Kindness in that town often came with conditions, and Clara felt them settling on her shoulders even before anyone spoke directly to her. She found lodging where she could, worked when she was allowed, and learned quickly which smiles were safe and which hid sharp edges. There was a gentleness to her movements, a careful way she took up space, as if she were afraid of being accused of wanting too much. Yet beneath it lived a quiet resilience, the kind born not from triumph but from endurance. She had survived disappointments that taught her to expect little, and winter did the rest of the teaching. It was inevitable that the town would begin to solve her problem in the way it always did, with practicality disguised as mercy. Elias Crow needed a wife, they said, or at least a woman to soften him. Clara needed a roof, protection from hunger, protection from judgment that grew crueler the longer she remained unattached. The idea passed from mouth to mouth until it felt less like a suggestion and more like a conclusion already reached. No one asked what kind of man Elias truly was, or what Clara feared most. Solutions rarely bother with such details. Elias heard of it as he heard most things, indirectly, through glances and lowered voices that grew quiet when he approached. He did not protest. Perhaps he believed this was the shape his life was meant to take, an arrangement born of necessity rather than desire. He had learned long ago that wanting led to loss, and he wore that lesson like armor. If a woman needed shelter and he could provide it, that seemed reason enough to agree. Anything more felt dangerous. Clara was told with fewer words and less care. Winter does not allow much time for refusal, and neither did the town. She weighed fear against survival and chose the latter, not because she believed Elias kind, but because she sensed he would at least be honest. There are worse things than the unknown, and she had met many of them already. They met outside the general store while snow fell thick enough to erase edges. Elias removed his gloves before speaking, a small gesture that would have gone unnoticed by most, but not by Clara. He did not touch her, did not crowd her space. His voice was low, careful, shaped as if words were tools he used sparingly. He offered shelter, nothing more, and waited. Clara met his eyes and saw not threat, but restraint, a man holding himself back from the world. In that moment, curiosity returned, and it followed them both as they turned toward the long white road ahead. Snow softened the world around the cabin, and with it, something in Elias began to loosen, though he did not yet have language for the change. Days passed measured by firewood and quiet meals, by the sound of Clara's careful footsteps learning the rhythm of the place. She never rearranged his life without asking, never filled silence with questions, and in return he learned how presence alone could be a kind of peace. The mountains no longer felt like walls but witnesses, holding their distance while something fragile took shape inside. Clara discovered that safety did not always announce itself with warmth and laughter. Sometimes it arrived as space, as a man who turned his back while she settled near the fire, as food left where she could take it without gratitude demanded in return. She watched Elias move through his days with deliberate care, as if afraid of breaking something unseen. The more she observed, the clearer it became that his solitude was not born of bitterness but of grief carried too long without sharing. The town did not release its grip easily. When Clara traveled down the slope for supplies, eyes followed her with renewed interest, sharper now that she belonged somewhere outside their reach. Words floated after her like ash, questioning her choices, predicting regret. Elias heard of it later and said nothing, though his shoulders tightened, and that night he sat longer by the door, listening for dangers that never came. He believed the town's judgment would eventually harm her, and the thought settled heavily in his chest. Winter tested them with a storm that arrived without warning, fierce enough to make the cabin groan. Wind forced its way through cracks, snow piled high against the walls, and the fire struggled beneath damp wood. Elias worked too long in the cold, pushing his body past sense, until pain overtook him and sent him to the floor with a breathless sound. Clara found him there, fear sharp and sudden, yet her hands did not shake as she tended him. She kept the fire alive, pressed warmth back into his skin, and spoke softly through the night so he would not drift away from her voice. In his fever he spoke, not to impress or confess, but because restraint had finally failed him. He told of a woman lost years before, of a future imagined and buried beneath an avalanche of chance. Clara listened without judgment, understanding that love did not vanish when it ended, but changed shape, becoming caution, becoming silence. When dawn arrived pale and quiet, Elias slept, and Clara sat beside him, realizing that what bound them now was not obligation, but shared survival. When he woke, weak and ashamed, he tried to retreat behind old habits, speaking of arrangements and gratitude, of how she would be better off returning to town come spring. Clara stopped him with a steadiness that surprised them both. She told him she had chosen to stay, not because she lacked options, but because she saw him clearly and found no fear there. Her words did not ask for promises, they asked for truth. Elias met her gaze fully for the first time, and something long held back broke open, gentle and overwhelming. Spring came slowly, as if cautious not to undo what winter had built. Snow retreated in patches, revealing dark earth ready to accept seed. Together they prepared the land, Elias teaching without instruction, Clara learning without needing permission. Their connection deepened through shared labor, through smiles exchanged without witnesses, through evenings where silence felt companionable rather than empty. Love did not announce itself, but it lived in the way Elias waited for Clara before eating, and in the way she rested her hand briefly on his arm, trusting it would be enough. When they walked into town side by side, the reaction was subdued but unmistakable. Elias stood straighter, not from pride, but from relief at no longer hiding. Clara lifted her chin, her presence calm and assured. The gossip faltered, confused by the absence of scandal, by the sight of a feared man made gentle and a helpless woman revealed as strong. Respect arrived quietly, earned without spectacle. Years later, when people spoke of Elias and Clara, they did so with a softness that surprised even themselves. The cabin became known not as a refuge from fear, but as a place where broken paths had quietly converged. Children passing through sensed welcome without knowing why. Travelers found rest there and carried the feeling onward, unable to name it. Elias learned that strength could include tenderness without loss, and Clara learned that choosing where to stand could become an act of courage. Their life was not perfect, but it was honest, shaped by weather, work, and mutual regard. It endured because both understood that love survives through attention, humility, and the willingness to remain present when fears whisper for retreat and silence threatens distance instead of understanding between.